Let me now introduce our panel. As a preface, let me say that we should recognize that this is a very challenging time in development finance, in humanitarian finance, and in climate finance. We've had some real successes over the last several years. A commitment to doubling adaptation finance, for example, in Glasgow at the COP. We've had, of course, finally meeting the $100 billion commitment. We've had, of course, the new quantitative goal, and many other things besides. But I think I don't need to sugarcoat it. There are many cuts coming in bilateral assistance across the global north. And that means that we have to be a lot more ambitious and a lot more strategic about using the money that we have now and ensuring that those institutions that do have financing deploy it in a creative, innovative, and powerful way. And I think now is more important than ever. For today's panel, we have, I'm very proud to say, a diverse array of finance bodies in the climate space and development space, all of them with different approaches and different financial instruments and expertise that they can bring to the table. We have two multilateral development banks, and some will be joining us online virtually. Let me start with the banks. We have from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. We have Sung Kyun, who is Associate Director and Head of Green Policy and Climate Analytics at the bank. If you could please come up to the stage. And online, we have from the African Development Bank, Mr. Anthony Nyongi, who is the Director of Climate Change and Green Growth. If you could wave your hand, please, so we can see you, because we don't have the labels here. We also have three multilateral climate funds that are joining us. We have from the climate investment funds in Washington, we have Matthew Pegon, who is Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the CIFs. Matthew, if you can wave. There you go. We have from the Green Climate Fund, Stephanie Speck, who's here with us. Stephanie, thank you for joining. And from the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, also based in Washington, we have Mr. Luis Tineo, who's Principal Advisor to the Executive Director of the fund. Hello, Luis. Thank you for joining us. And finally, I think very exciting as well, we have a member of the African Risk Capacity, which, as many of you know, is a risk insurance pool that has been working in Africa for many years. Anaïs Simoniou, thank you for joining us. Let me move over here. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you here. What I'll try to do is all of you come from very different institutions with different priorities, and so I'm going to try to customize this a little bit so that we can have a good, meaningful conversation. Let's keep it sort of informal. Folks, I'm sure will have questions as well, and that way we can have a free-flowing discussion. Let me perhaps start with the banks, starting with EBRD. You guys are a special multilateral bank because you work very closely with the private sector. That's what makes EBRD special. You have a very interesting array of regions in which you work, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, and of course a lot of engagement with the private sectors in those areas. I'm curious, could you tell us a bit more about how you approach climate mobility? How does it fit into this portfolio that you have built over the years?
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this very important event. EBRD is established as a transition bank, so helping countries transition to market economies. And over the years, we have really specialized in also responding to various types of crises. So climate mobility, in some ways, takes a lot of that experience into account, and in terms of the tools and the financial instruments that we're able to deploy. We envision it to be quite similar. So, for example, EBRD has responded to the Syrian refugee crisis and helping countries like Jordan and Turkey in being able to accommodate the refugees, and by investing in municipal infrastructures like solid waste and wastewater treatment facilities and other kind of urban infrastructure projects, as well as responding to the more recent earthquake crisis in Turkey, so helping Turkey reconstruct after the earthquake and really kind of getting involved in the reconstruction of the housing sector, the buildings, and also, of course, Ukraine, and responding to the crisis by sending in emergency financing, but also continuing to get involved with the corporates in trying to respond in the changing dynamics. So, climate mobility, in that sense, is really about assessing the risks at portfolio and at project levels, and really kind of identifying how material it is, and being able to design the appropriate levels of intervention, taking into account the time scale and the scale of the impact that we anticipate. So that involves a lot of analysis and diagnostics upfront. Maybe I'll stop there.
Got it. Very helpful. Anthony, let me turn to you. The African Development Bank has been a leader in adaptation. You have made this a priority in your bank. You have committed billions of dollars in new financing for adaptation. And of course, the continent faces a number of challenges in climate mobility. We've heard about many of them here in the last day and a half. How does climate mobility fit into that portfolio of the bank? And by the way, congratulations on the new president of the institution.
Yeah, thank you very much. And sorry I couldn't join you in person. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Yes. Yeah, my apologies I couldn't join you in person. And this is a very interesting and very important topic. So thanks for inviting us to this event. As we all know, it's on record that 9 of the 10 most vulnerable continents, countries, at least as at last year, were in Africa. And when you look at climate change impacts per GDP, we have the highest, of the adverse impacts. And so for us, the mandate of the African Development Bank is to support the socio-economic development of African states. Anything that threatens our job and threatens the peace of the continent. And we are seeing that in climate change already, that it's leading to a reversal in some of the gains that the continent has made. And that's what we are here to fight. But we also know that most people really don't see mobility for what it is in Africa. It's not like moving goods. People are spiritually connected to their lands. And there's a meaning that even no matter the amount of restoration or what you think you've done, does not restore back that feeling of being alienated from their land. So at the African Development Bank, our goal is on prevention. We spend most of our resources on resilience building. How do we ensure that those don't come in? Because the mobility, when you push it further, comes with fragility, then ends up with insecurity, with insurgencies and all manner of things. So it's a nexus. And we don't just look at it alone. So for the African Development Bank, it's very important that we build resilience and adaptation to minimize the need for that prevention. And we've seen that, like you've mentioned, in all our adaptation works, we spend more than 40% of our investments on climate, and about 60% of that goes to adaptation and resilience for a purpose. But let me also note that this is not just done haphazardly. We have policies that guide us. Our 10-year strategy is focused on resilience. Our climate change action plan is strategy and action plan are also focused on resilience. And so we have it that as a corporate commitment that at least 100% of our investment should be based on climate-informed design. Because when we have that, it minimizes the impacts we are going to have much later and they need to move. And let me also note that even if we are concentrating on adaptation and resilience, we also deal with migrations. What happens? There's a limit to adaptation. What happens after that? There's a migration. So how do we deal with that? We have policies, we have projects that enshrine all this together. But we know that when we deal with that migration is not all bad. It's good for us in the African continent when you talk about it. If it's well planned, programmed, and delivered, migration brings in a lot. So we then look at how do we manage the migration? If we can't manage it, how do we ensure that it is orderly and progressive, respecting the dignitaries of Africans? The outgoing president of the bank keeps saying that the future of Africa's youth is not the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, where they are escaping, looking for opportunities. But the opportunity rests in Africa. And so we have projects in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel, that seek to rebuild livelihoods and keep Africans in Africa productively. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Very, very helpful and inspiring. Let me turn to the Climate Fund. Stephanie, the Green Climate Fund, the largest dedicated fund for climate. I served on the board for 4 years. It's a big machine. It's a complex machine. Roughly half your investments go into reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The other half is very much focused on resilience and adaptation. When you think about climate mobility, which is a relatively, if you like, non-traditional aspect of resilience or a newer area, how do you think about it in the context of your existing portfolio and the future of financing?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I had the privilege to visit South Sudan in March this year. It was the first time visiting South Sudan, and we were able to travel from Juba to Bentiu, which is right up in the north, and you may know that it's home to South Sudan's largest refugee camp, and also a large internally displaced population. Refugees have fled from conflict, and internally displaced people have fled from floods. 4 years of unabated flooding. And when you fly there in a very small, bumpy plane, you can see water as far as the eye can see. So internally displaced people cannot return home because of flooding. Conflict and climate refugees cannot return home because of conflict and loss of livelihoods. What kind of choice is that? Well, the fact is, it's not a choice. There is no choice in that situation. And that is what GCF is grappling with. How do we, on one hand, make sure that climate mobility can be a positive planned function of adaptation, and make sure that it is not a consequence leading to loss and damage, loss of life and loss of livelihoods. So when GCF is looking at its portfolio, we are looking far more deliberately at this issue as a tool of adaptation. Now, you're right to say that the climate finance model has suffered huge blows, not just in the last 6 months, but even a little earlier. And even though GCF has $17 billion committed, this is, if I were to be diplomatic, I would say this is a growing area of our portfolio. To be less diplomatic, I'd say it's a very underfunded area of our portfolio. But the opportunity that comes from the risk to international development and climate finance at the moment is climate finance must be made to work harder. So whereas over the last few years we've struggled to put climate and poverty reduction in the same sentence, climate finance and emerging from humanitarian dependence, climate finance and delivering peace dividends, that's no longer the case. Climate finance is going to have to work harder and smarter. The challenge for a big fund like GCF, and we've heard about it today, is how do we move away from we're the biggest and we do big shiny things to how do we make sure that we're engaging with communities at the last mile or the front mile in relation to this topic, and how do we make sure that community-led adaptation relates to the topic of climate mobility, and how do we make sure that a big fund can get esse money right down to local level. That's something we're grappling with at the moment.
Luis, speaking of loss and damage, you're the newest institution here. I can't understate how important the creation of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage has been, not just in the negotiation rooms, but for the Global South in general. Obviously, huge expectations about what the fund will do, but I think it's important to get the basics right, and I know the board is working very hard with you all to get the modalities of financing in good shape before you start funding things. Obviously, climate mobility and loss and damage are intimately connected. How do you think about this? You yourself coming from with a lot of expertise in migration. How do you think about loss and damage and climate migration together in your position?
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you, Leo, and the Berlin Climate Mobility Forum for the invitation to participate. I'm here on behalf of the Executive Director, Ibrahima Diong, who would have liked to be here, but he delegated to me. So I'm in my capacity as a principal advisor. I've been following the evolution of the fund since we started operations back in November. As you might remember, this loss and damage is not a new topic. Of course, we have been working on it for the past 3 decades. The idea of having a fund dedicated to loss and damage, to me, is a significant progress by the climate community. Now, going from rhetoric to action is what we are at this point. We are working at the so-called Barbados implementation modalities. This is the framework by which the fund would like to pilot its first projects. We are allocating about $250 million by early January next year. And the idea there is to test the ground, to test the demand, and to test the topics that the fund can address. I would imagine that it's logical that climate mobility would be among the key elements for eligibility to access the fund. Of course, at this point, we are moving from creating the architectural pieces or the governance pieces into the implementation part. And there are 3 principles. The first one is a bottom-up approach, country-owned. The second is direct budget support in the form of grants. And the third is an allocation that guarantees funding for the least developing countries and the seeds. I believe that what my colleague at GCF was highlighting is very relevant right now to the work of the FRLD. And I can anticipate that there are a number of trade-offs. Among others, the issue of coordination with other vertical funds. It is clear that FRLD was created with a dedicated mandate on loss and damage. However, the challenge right now is that there are more than 80 initiatives addressing issues of loss and damage. And we hope that FRLD can present a case for being the platform by which coherence and coordination can happen at the same time. We feel that climate mobility is an important priority. These countries that we are targeting, among others, face incredible challenges, if not already losses and damages, created tremendous stress on communities and displacement, around these countries. So it's a good point that you raised, Leo. The fund is already up and running, not necessarily in operational terms, but in terms of engagement, and we are happy to participate here. I'll take questions as we keep going. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. And let me underscore, editorialize here a little bit, how important it is that ultimately the funds coordinate effectively in this area, because I suspect many of the country and government officials in the audience are not going to want to fill out 3, 4, or 5 different applications for a climate mobility project, right? And so eventually finding an appropriate financial division of labor will be essential. Let me go to the CIFs here, and I know that Matthew, the funds have been working on adaptation for a long time, since the beginning when it used to be called PPCR. And I know that you are now renovating and renewing some of those efforts. we'd be very interested in hearing how you look at climate mobility and how this theme will play in your future plans for resilience and adaptation financing.
Thanks, Leo. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, greetings from Washington, D.C. Thanks for having me here. It's a true pleasure. When you think about mobility, I think it's important to see it through its different dimensions, right? It's both a symptom of vulnerability, but also a potential strategy for adaptation. And so it's not just about who moves, but oftentimes it's also about those that can't. And so when we talk with our partner countries, in many instances, movement is less of a choice and more a signal that adaptive systems have failed. And that shows you a little bit the two areas of work for a climate fund such as ours. One is to finance what helps people to stay safe, but also when that is not an option, to finance and support them to move with dignity. Leo, it's great that you mentioned the PPCR program. This is indeed one of our oldest programs in the fund, and through this program, we've supported countries to prepare to climate shocks and develop contingency plan to protect lives, property, and livelihoods. We've supported 28 countries, reached 65 million people, and supported them with more than $1 billion of concessional investment and $3 billion of concessional, of co-financing. And what is interesting in this program is that it's, to my knowledge, one of the few programs of this size that has gone through the entire cycle, that has been completed, and it's gone through its final evaluation, and it's been directly informed our new resilience program, ARISE, where we've been embedding climate mobility in the way we design, fund, and deliver those resilience investments. And the program is going to focus on 1, resilient supply chains, 2, fiscal systems, 3, climate smart infrastructure, and 4, social inclusion. And those are all pillars that intersect directly with mobility and adaptive capacity.
Thanks so much. I think reminds me of the comments we heard from the banks as well, that it's not, climate mobility is not really a self-standing theme, but really one that has to be mainstreamed across multiple verticals. We have Anaïs here from Paris. She comes from a different type of institution, one that focuses on insurance, specifically parametric insurance, the type of insurance policies that allow governments to prepare for a disaster, a climate-related event, and then money will disperse quickly. And that's the magic, I think, of the insurance policies that ARC has been putting out for many years. And so let me turn to you. Where do you think, how do you think insurance could play a role here in the conversation on climate mobility?
Thank you for the invitation and the question. ARC Limited is a specialized entity of the African Union. So we help countries build resilience when it comes to climate change and natural catastrophes. Really, as you mentioned, what we focus on is disaster response. So basically, we help countries through our agency to help prepare for the catastrophe, so they design contingency plans, and then we are able, when the disaster arrives, to disperse very quickly the payout in order for them to implement the implementation plans and contingency plans very quickly before the disaster turns into humanitarian disaster. So really, that's where we are very able to not only help the vulnerable communities, either build resilience and stay, because there are crops that are dispersed as part of the contingency plans, and to build resilience when it comes to agricultural sector and food security, but also because there is small components depending on what the communities and the countries have selected of cash disbursements as well. So that will help people that want to relocate or move on to other projects, do so in a very peaceful manner. So when it comes to displaced population, I agree on the fact that it's not, climate mobility shouldn't be approached from a decorrelated point of view. It has to be embedded in response planning, climate change plannings from countries. And for that, we also work within, but we'll have time to discuss that, work within the countries with different ministries in order to make sure that the insurance tool isn't just a layer that is added into the ecosystem, but actually embedded into a more global plan that actually serves each country and each community. So that's it.
Let me now move to some of this is all wonderful, but, right, ultimately your institutions will finance things that are carefully proposed, that have clear theories of change, that have a lot of work invested in them in terms of bankability and granularity, the financial components, but also the policy elements. And I suspect that one of the big barriers to many countries is developing these proposals that are good enough to get funding from GCF, from the banks, or wherever, right? Data is an issue. We've discussed it here over the last day and a half. There isn't always enough, and policymakers want to know where are people going to be who have been displaced, where are they going to be in 6 days, in 6 months, in 6 years, right? That will then facilitate the investment. So data, I think, is one potential barrier. The other one I think you just referred to, which is because this is an issue that cuts across multiple policy dimensions, many countries will have multi-ministry conversations, right? This will reside in the Environment Ministry, the Interior Ministry, the Finance Ministry. And as we all know, having worked in government, or those who have, that can be messy, right? And time-consuming. And of course, certainly the banks, you work with the finance ministries primarily, the GCF has its own accredited entities. How do you propose to, or what would you recommend in terms of trying to get our head around these issues of data on one hand, and what I would call an inter-ministerial dialogue with your clients on the other? And open to anybody who wants, raise your hand.
Maybe I'll kickstart. In terms of data, certainly a real challenge when it comes to translating to project proposals, because when it comes to financing, it really needs to come a level down from kind of the high level assessment. Really, as I mentioned earlier, it has to be location specific. What is the timeline of when this impact will occur, and what is the scale? There needs to be these type of estimations in order to then reflect it into financial analysis and then design appropriate measures to mitigate that impact. So in that sense, there needs to be a lot of effort made, particularly integrating this climate mobility dimension to the kind of the rest of the diagnostic works that are happening in the climate space. Although I do think that with the emergence of a lot of data tools, geospatial data, et cetera, that could be further kind of used more actively to inform, again, the dimensions that we have not more actively thought of before. To your question about the kind of coordination, it's not like we are kind of this subject again is coming from a vacuum in the sense that a lot of the countries have developed their national determined contributions, and some have developed the long-term strategies, and that process has already gone for several years, contributing to establishing for many countries actually a governance process that requires interministerial kind of coordination and discussion around how to prioritize different climate and development actions. Of course, the degrees are different, and some countries are more ahead and not. But certainly that effort is ongoing, and this year there's also the momentum to submit the kind of NDC 3.0, and that process really needs to be leveraged, and the climate mobility discussion really needs to feed into that and reflected back into individual sectoral policies and plans as to how relevant is their sector in the context of climate mobility. So for example, which sectors and which segments of that subsector are going to be most impacted, what is going to be the level of risk, and how do you need to plan it? Is it a policy measure? Is it an investment measure? Is it a capacity building awareness issue? I think those really need to be tailored to really translate into concrete actions on the ground.
I might make a comment on data and then where help resides to make good investment decisions. The question of data I find very vexing. Actually, countries and our contributor countries in particular to GCF are very quick to tell us that they clearly have data pointing to risk of investment. And if there's data pointing to risk of investment, it makes me wonder, why do we have access to that data and not the data about the opportunity for investment? I actually think there's a wealth of data that is available. It just sits in certain pockets. It sits in with the private sector, who are often looking for business continuity strategies. It sits with international organisations in the UN who spend millions of dollars a year collecting data and then often hold on to it, despite the fact that we're all publicly funded and data is a public good. So one of the first things I say to people who are looking to access GCF money is, I don't think the failure or the problem area is lack of data. The data is there. We've just got to help you make those connections and get that data. To me, the question is also not just about increasing finance into this area, it's the type of finance. It's making sure that the finance we deliver is fit for purpose. And that's why I was quite candid in saying this is an area that GCF needs to learn in. That's why we make available to every country, every developing country, $7 million every 4 years to plan out their investments, so that when we come in with a big project, we're confident that it is meeting the needs, it's at the appropriate scale, and it's getting to where it needs to go into a country. So every country has available $7 million of readiness to make them ready to absorb climate financing. We see very little concentration of countries on this topic. So that's one of the things we will seek to deliberately and proactively encourage in this programming period. There are many resources, there are many connections in this room who can work with countries to enable them to make smart, planned investments in this space. And we have a couple of great examples emerging through the portfolio. Tuvalu, a $38 million investment through UNDP to enable the population to move to stay. That's really the name of the project. And the important thing to GCF is not going in and telling countries what to do, but hearing from countries about what they want us to fund. And Tuvalu is a great example of that. Tuvalu has an extraordinarily detailed long-term adaptation plan. It's backed by satellite data. It's backed by mobility data that allows us to invest confidently. So let me say, I think the data's there. I think there's plenty of it. GCF can help make those connections. And GCF is really open to thinking about how do we scale and target community-level investment appropriately in this area, hearing from the countries themselves once they've spent that money to get to that point where they know what they would like.
Fascinating. Anybody on the screen want to jump on this one?
Yeah, can I come in there?
Please go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really support the comment on the data, but let me also note that Africa, particularly programs in the dark, we have fewer MET stations on the continent than we have in Switzerland as a country or in Germany as a country. And this is really not helpful for us. In terms of being able to generate such data, we established the ClimDev Africa program that is basically providing automatic weather stations across. Then we've also established what we call the Africa Financial Alliance on Climate Change, AFAC, which brings together key players in Africa's financial industry to support trend, create awareness in the use of data, actually factoring this data into investment decisions. And in so doing, we also have come across the fact, or we know that many of these African countries really still have hard copy data in paper form. And we're doing what we can at the pace we can to digitize or digitalize those information, those data, which is really very important for us. And finally, talking about how do we work? We need to look at ourselves as an African Development Bank, an institution that climate change is cross-cutting. Mobility is also cross-cutting. How do we ensure that we work together? We've realized that and then set as a target that every of our projects must be based on climate-informed design. On the other hand, we're also working with countries to create or establish interministerial department platforms that allow them to work together, bring all the ministries together. And thirdly, the partnerships that we have, be the private sector. We know that private sector will play a very important role in this, but they are not there. Africa's private sector is the SMEs, and they are contributing the least to climate finance. We're working with them. Then the UN agencies and other local institutions on the ground, we need them for that last mile connectivity. We as MDBs, we can work at large scale, big scale, broad scale, but actually taking this to the ground, to the local community, sometimes is beyond us. And that's where the partnerships with local institutions have been very helpful. Thank you.
If I may, being an insurance facility, I cannot emphasize enough the need of data. Not only historical data, but forecasts as well that are granular enough to enable insurance ecosystem to embark on those financing modes. What we've been doing, and maybe I'll spend a little more time of that in terms of cooperation within the countries, is that we have set up technical groups within each country that is actually a platform for countries to decide which are the ministries and which are the stakeholders within the countries. And this typically, in some countries, you will have the Minister of Planning, the Ministry of Planning, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of in charge of, communities, sometimes genders as well. And that's actually very important in terms of, making sure that not only there is ownership and that there are tailored solutions at the country's level, but also make sure that there is continuity. Because what we forget to say a lot is that the turnover at the ministerial levels are sometimes a key component that jeopardize like a whole project that we have been working on for the past months or years. So that's actually, it's not only a question of ensuring that there are cross communications about countries, but that whatever we put in place is actually sustainable. One thing we also forget a lot is that when we think about, when you're talking about insurance and also finance tools to embark on these resilience projects, we forget talking about the regulators. And regulators, when it comes to insurance or financing, are key in terms of facilitating whatever we are putting in place into the country. So having that African Union mandate, what we try to do as well is to make sure that we offer platform and regulatory roundtable for regulators to actually be able to interact with each other and make sure that, okay, I can be inspired by what they're doing in Senegal, what they are doing in East Africa, what we are doing in, for example, countries that usually don't talk to each other, or even though they do, it stays at such a high level that there is no actually technical or legal or framework engagements for those very, very little but huge projects. So that's also something that we need to take into account when we talk about cross-sectorial conversations. Thanks.
Got it. So we've heard so far a lot about the importance of interministerial platforms and how to take advantage of those. The importance of data, both what's out there and what may not be out there. And I think that requires a more granular conversation about what kinds of data to answer what kinds of questions residing in which repositories. And wherever there isn't data, how do we plug the gaps, right? Anybody else on the screen want to jump in on this question?
If I may, very quickly on and it's funny, I was listening to Stephanie's comment and reading my notes on, bringing together ministries of finance, planning, environment, and social development, and I think she really nailed it. And with, it seems the conversation has really been othering around that theme. This is really a topic that requires cross-ministerial coordination to be successful, and I think it fits in quite nicely with the way CIF works as a fund, and it's a rather unique feature of the CIF, which is the bulk of our financing goes through what we call a programmatic approach, where effectively the starting point to any project seeking concessional finance is a country-led investment plan that typically tends to be led by the Ministry of Planning or the Ministry of Finance, and resources are being provided to the country to build that plan. And then once that plan is in place, and only when that plan is in place, our partners, MDBs, can submit a project that relate to the plan. And it's interesting because it sort of forces the ecosystem really to think of these things as a programmatic approach, and not so much sort of individual investments that don't necessarily relate to each other. And we found that to be quite a successful model, especially when it comes to financing resiliency, generally speaking.
I would add that how important it's going to be that eventually there be like a single plan that can be used by multiple funders, because we don't want 7 different country-owned finance plans for each country, right? That's just too much duplication. And so I think that'll be a critical piece of this. Luis, did you want to jump in?
Yes, of course. Obviously, many of my colleagues have already addressed the point. It's a great opportunity for FRLD to start learning, from others. I would say that you can imagine that loss and damage requires significant data. Otherwise, the risk of FRLD is to volunteer for projects that others are addressing the issues upon. This is a critical point for us. We have been talking to many institutions to see how much we can piggyback on those data platforms. For example, we have had discussions with the Santiago network. We don't want to turn the FRLD into a capacity building facility, for example, or a gap filler. And data, of course, is one of those that require significant resources. So we would rather like to rely on the work of others. I'm very familiar with what Matthew said on the CIF. Of course, those investment plans are fed by significant data. It's not easy, and it's not an overnight delivery. So we are learning from that. Nevertheless, let me take the point of the panel that data is important so long as we can fix the issue of access and the issue of the instrument that we are using to facilitate action. And in that, I guess that the system or the ecosystem has already significant complexities. And as far as we have seen in appraising the opportunities for FRLD to be a significant player, an impactful player, is that there is a bit of a gap in between the use of data and the instruments that you apply. For example, we received significant demands and expectations from the countries indicating that, instruments do not match the expectations of the countries because, of course, for the instruments to be suitable to the needs of loss and damage, you need significant data. For example, for the insurance risk, to give you an example, one that has significant overlap and complementarity with loss and damages. When we are talking about, say, weather forecast or early warning systems, heavy investments in data. When we are talking about PDNAs for appraising, post-disaster situations, when we are working on the gaps, say, dealing with humanitarian interventions, or for that matter, climate mobility, that is where, the main challenges remain, not for FRLD, for all the climate vertical funds for sure, but indeed for FRLD is an opportunity to learn and improve the situation upon.
I'm going to go to the audience in a second. I start thinking now about your hard brain-breaking questions about money. But before I go back to the audience, I want to focus a little bit on cities. A lot of, I spoke recently with a World Bank colleague, and he said, look, a lot of cities around the world, including in the global north, are just catching up. They're trying to deal with the existing populations, the existing needs. They're not really thinking ahead. And that's the key to climate mobility, especially when it is expressed in terms of rural-urban migration. Many of you work with cities, you have city programs. How are you working with those colleagues on the city side? How can we help build cities that are much better at thinking ahead, at absorbing future entrants, regardless of whether they're pushed by climate or by other factors?
I'll start. EBRD has a flagship program called Green Cities Program, and it covers about, I don't know the latest figure, about 50 cities plus across the region. And basically, it is helping cities develop an action plan that's based off of the assessment of the environmental and social risks, so hotspots, and really actively prioritizing measures that can address that at a short, medium, and long term. And a lot of these actions are combined both with policy and investment actions, and really looking at how those investments could be financed. So it's really actively thinking about the investment needs and what type of financial instruments are necessary in order to make them happen. These plans at the moment are looking within the boundaries of the cities, and so it doesn't particularly incorporate enough information, again, because of the data gap. What would, if there was a climate shock in a neighborhood city or in the region, and that will trigger more migration, or if that city itself is at risk, and that will lead to citizens moving out of it, what would the city look like in 5-10 years? That type of assessment is not being done. So it's really based off of the status quo. So that is something that we are actively thinking about how to incorporate better, again, with more emerging information and data. I do definitely think there is room for optimization by leveraging and better access to the existing data. And also, within the existing cities, there is a bigger demand to look into heat resilience. So that certainly, we sense that those are becoming important agendas for the cities. So that is something that we're also working towards incorporating more into our urban financing and also policy dialogue and technical assistance. We do in combination all these activities. And last but not least, we have been learning a lot of lessons through our just transition activities, so more like fossil fuel asset kind of phase out and that implication of the livelihoods. And we've been helping livelihoods affected with skills transfer, job creation, et cetera. And I think there is some parallel to with the whole climate mobility agenda, and we're looking to really see what we can replicate or learn and actively use going forward with the increasing importance on this topic.
I think it's a great question, and I think whenever we talk about cities, we automatically think about settings, and so when you think about settings, you automatically think about infrastructure. And I think urban resilience and investment in urban resilience in the GCF portfolio, I couldn't put a number on it, but I think it would pale alongside our investment into agriculture, for example, or food systems. And we know that the trend is mass migration towards cities. So cities will have to be infrastructurally sound. That means climate resilient infrastructure. Look at the reconstruction opportunities in Syria at the moment, where we have a natural tendency to go back to cities, a $53 billion reconstruction plan on the table from Arab and Gulf states, none of it climate informed. So we've got massive opportunities around infrastructure. But I think the particularly tricky area is around economic ecosystems. And we know that in many of these settings where there's particularly been unplanned forced migration and cities have sprung up, there is an owned ecosystem that functions within those settings, and it has very little resemblance to the external economic ecosystem. It has very little connection with it, and I think that's why GCF is really thinking proactively about how do we move away from thinking about sectors of investment to moments of investment. So in that setting of protracted humanitarian dependency in refugee settings, how would we put climate finance into that setting to work both with host communities and the refugee or migrant or displaced community itself to look at how do we stimulate catalytic investment, or how do we provide catalytic investment in that area of economic livelihood connection between the community that's been moved and the host community that's there, so that we reduce the burden, we increase the political acceptability of that population being in place. So I urge countries, when they're thinking about investment, not just around that infrastructure investment, but what does that economic system, ecosystem, livelihood investment look like, and what's the role for climate finance in that space?
And I just want to underscore one point that you just made here, which is that these investments and ensuring that receiving communities are better prepared is ultimately going to mean that those who are coming in are going to be hopefully welcomed and seen as people who need protection and absorption into the productive economic sectors, and not as outsiders, and all the prejudices that are now beginning to accrue. Right now, that hostility is focused on international migration, but you could easily see a situation where those hostilities are turned inwards within a country to their own citizens, and a lot of that depends on degrees of scarcity and the perception that, quote unquote, there isn't enough, right? And that's why investment is so important. Anybody in the screen want to jump in on cities? You don't have to, just a choice. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me note that for most African cities, the governance structure does not allow for adequate funding or capacity within the cities. They are central government delivered. Most governments are central government with very little autonomy or capacity going to the cities or to the rural areas. And so for us at the African Development Bank, we've established a full department that faces urban issues, and also now extended to peri-urban areas. What is it that we are doing? We've also been able to establish the urban municipal development facility that provides resources to countries to help them in the soft issues, soft infrastructure within the cities, hard infrastructure within the cities. So that's really extremely very important for us. But we also know, like we've said, we work across all areas. Whether it's an infrastructure project, it will affect the cities. And we have to grapple with these issues because our cities are growing at very unprecedented rates, most African cities, either directly through rural-urban migration, which we're also fighting hard to stop through provision of livelihoods in the originating areas, or through disaster-driven migrations. When these things happen, people move to the sea, when there is drought, when there is water scarcity and all that. And then we also have the natural growth itself in the population, which is very high. So these are a major issue for us at the African Development Bank, and we are dealing with them. But the resources are not there. And let me say this, in case I don't have the opportunity to say it again. We've all talked about this, which is very important. I said at the beginning, there's a limit to adaptation, which means we cannot continuously adapt forever. We have not mentioned in this session yet the need for the polluters who are causing the issues to be able to stop as a major way in which we can address issues of mobility. If we cannot cut emissions, then it will be very difficult for us to keep coping no matter the amount of resources that we have. Thank you.
And we did hear from the organizers of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty yesterday, so that is very much appreciated by folks here, the need to cut emissions. Let me switch gears slightly and see if the audience would like to step in here and ask. Linus? Do we have a mic?
Thank you. Fantastic panel. Really, really good. My name is Linus Bengtsson. I'm the chair of the board of Flowminder. We're a Swedish nonprofit, and we work with mobile operators to access their data in anonymized format to provide very detailed and close to real-time data on population mobility, displacement, migration. And we're working in a number of low and middle-income countries, but we could be working in many more. And I'm really curious to hear, because of course all these initiatives need to be country-led. That's extremely important. But I'm also really want to push these new solutions. We have some new solutions, others have as well, that can really disrupt and really provide much more cost-efficient support. And how are you as banks and as organizations supporting new solutions to be implemented? Thank you.
Let me collect a couple, because there's clearly appetite out there. In the back, yes, thank you.
Me, right? Hi, I'm Laura Serna, GGCM fellow. I'm from Colombia, and I have a question about the local access from the no-profile organization that are looking for finance to adaptation process. I think that we are suffering so much gaps around how to have access to finance process about the adaptation in the cities, but also in the rural parts. So I would like to know, what do you think about it, but also what are the solutions for organizations that are small, that probably doesn't understand all these steps or all these mechanisms. So thank you so much.
Let me take a third, right here.
Thank you very much. Verena, UNICEF, now here in Berlin, heading the team. I've been listening very carefully, and also have just come back late last night from Bonn, where we've also been having similar conversations with GCF colleagues, with colleagues from different banks and others. And I'm scratching my head, so it's a little bit of a provocative question, so please help me out. I'm scratching my head that we are obviously looking for the right type of financing, and I think it was said about it's not just about the amount of money, it's the instrument tailored to the context that is fit for purpose for the issue that we're grappling with here. How do we build in and bake in climate influence, climate accelerated mobility patterns, and how do we turn them from forced to planned, designed, enabled, empowering, and so on? At the same time, we are actually looking at, across the portfolios of the financing options, and it would be really interesting to hear from the different colleagues that sit on these instruments. So much of the solutions in other contexts, they're discussed in exactly the same way. We need more early warning investments. We need more DRR preparation, adaptation investments. We need social protection as a tool to address, climate-induced mobility. We need climate-resilient infrastructure from water to schools to you name it. And all of this needs to be in the NDCs, in the NAPs, in the national planning documents as a prerequisite. Where is the missing bit that nowhere else is being addressed in DRR discussions, in social protection discussions, in infrastructure-focused discussions, that is unique and underfunded and under-observed or under-recognized, that is unique to that sort of mobility piece? Is it financing for pathways? Is it where is it that is not being addressed somewhere else? And I'm really asking myself this open question because so many of the other conversations happen without mobility being addressed sufficiently, but we won't be able to get the big financing moving unless it is also speaking to the DRR crowd, the early warning crowd, the social protection crowd, the infrastructure crowd. So where is the unique piece? And is it really a question of financing for climate mobility, or making sure that climate mobility really is addressed in all these other conversations where the big money programs, projects are being developed, implemented, but much too little, and much too little in particular in those contexts most affected?
So I would wrap the first and third question. I'll go to another round in a second. I would say the first and third questions here are connected. Where are the gaps in the solutions to climate mobility? I think what the panel has been saying is climate mobility shouldn't just become another pot that needs to be funded, but rather it's a set of insights and practices that have to be baked into all of the verticals, whether it's cities or food security or infrastructure and so on. But yet, I think there's still missing pieces, right? And we heard about data that may or may not be there, or even if it's there, it hasn't been accessed, and how do you access it, and so on. So magic formula, what's the gap here is one question. And I would say the other one is really about access by local institutions. And I know there's a scale problem here, right? I mean, GCF, your micro level is, I think, 10 million and up, right? And we're talking here about, with CCAF and so on, we're talking about under $100,000, right? So how do we deal with the retail components, the fact that it takes a lot of transaction costs to really go down all the way to the grassroots, if you will. And at some point, the transaction costs overwhelm the value of doing this. Anything resonate with folks? You want to jump in on any of those? Let's start at the end here.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the question. I was afraid we wouldn't have the opportunity to address that today. Really, I think the issue we have is not a missing piece in terms of financing or in terms of matter to be addressed. When we take, for example, climate change, catastrophes, mobility, early warning actions, anticipatory actions, data is always going to be a matter to address, because the more we'll go, the more we'll need the data to be granular, right? We'll always have a question about ownership that is much more addressed in some countries than others. In my opinion, the real challenge we are having is collaboration. So it's not a finance matter. It's about, we are talking about planning on the other side. Then on the other side, we are talking about how do we address mobility. Then last year I was in Nigeria and we were talking about how do we make sure that those finances embed displaced population that are, not only climate related, but also political political displaced population. So the issue for me is the lack of collaboration and the fact that we are having those conversations in silos. As long as we don't understand and we don't fully sorry, English is not my first language, the words are coming in French. So as long as we don't collectively embark on the fact that, okay, if we want, for example, our cities to be more resilient, we need those meteorological stations to be on point. And there is no way of having, for example, parametric insurance if on the ground we don't have those materials that would enable us to have the data. And it doesn't make sense to have that conversation if the country is having that other side conversation about infrastructure, or if, for example, we are not addressing the long-term plan and we are just addressing immediate warning. So we will always be in reaction mode if we don't have that global conversation about where are the gaps within each region and within each country, and we will always be reacting instead of planning and addressing the gaps. So for me, it's not a question on finance. It's a question of really collaboration at every level. When it comes to finance, when it comes to technical, when it comes to political, we are not talking together. And that's why we will be, having those conversations again and again and again at different levels. So we need to start collaborating.
Well, let me jump to the screen for a second. Anybody want to jump in?
Leo, maybe quickly, and I know I wasn't really there in your rephrase, but I want to address Lina's question, which I interpreted as what about the private sector, and how can private sector access some of those resources? And that's a question that is dear to my heart, since I had to grapple with the same question in my previous career. And I think the short answer is that it's a challenge, right? The system as it stands right now has been primarily designed for countries and sovereigns and the public sector to access those sources of finance, and to a large extent, I think it's a matter of adjusting things to the margin so that it is suitable for private sector finance. And so, first of all, in terms of process, as much as a centralized and planning process is highly relevant when you talk about public sector financing, I think you do need to sort of switch gear to finance innovations and to finance disruption. And that means being very comfortable in financing a project that arises in a given country that was not anticipated by any investment plan. And you need dedicated windows to do that. We have one of those at the CIF that is precisely meant to do that. It touches on instruments as well. A lot of those resources typically tend to be accessible as debt. But here we're probably more talking about equity financing and how can we extend more equity finance to those companies, especially when it comes to data, right? Data provider to a large extent at this point in time will require equity as opposed to sort of leverage their balance sheet. And finally, it's the process and what we ask those companies, or what we ask the MDBs when they submit those projects. This idea that you need to knock on the door to a climate fund with a pipeline of readily projects that need concessional finance, that's not the way this works. You're not going to be going out and seeking project if you don't have certainty that you have concessional resources available to finance them. So you need to switch a little bit the way things work in that domain. But I think most of the major funds are in the process of understanding that and designing sort of the tools and the processes and the instruments also to precisely finance those companies.
Thank you, Matthew. Anybody else on the screen?
Yeah, can I come in?
Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think some of these points have been hit. I remember reading a report not too long ago that most disaster risk financing is actually ex post and not ex ante. And if we could do a partnership, for instance, between the MDBs, maybe reflected by the African Development Bank, in being able to push more money into prevention, into resilience building, it might reduce the need for all that money ex post, putting people in what do they call them, in camps and so on. It doesn't really help much. So I really call for a stronger partnership between those two communities that deal with the crisis after it has happened on humanitarian grounds, and those who are actively pushing to see how they can reduce that. And then secondly, we've talked about finance. Yes, it's been very difficult. We know that 90% of the resources we have financed goes to mitigation, 10% goes to adaptation, resilience building, and mobility and fragility, all the things you can list. That's grossly insufficient. So, and most of those resources truly are from concessional resources, loans for adaptation. And most countries are unable to have access to them. Many of our countries have reached their borrowing limits, and they can't take this money, and there's really nothing one can do about it. So at the African Development Bank, we've established what we call the climate action window that says, look, climate finance is supposed to have 4 qualities. It should be available, it should be adequate, it should be accessible, and it should be affordable. This, we have been able to set up a facility that depicts all these criteria, providing grant elements only, turnaround time very fast, 3-6 months, basically to ensure that people who need resources have gotten them and all the rest of the things that come with them. So for us, it's important. But then for most people still look at the MDBs. You talk about 100 millions and the 1 billion and the 500 million. What happens to us? So we set up the Africa Climate Change Facility that gives grants of about 250, maximum 800 to $1 million at the most, allowing those who would never have been able to access bigger grants to get there first. So it's a training ground also, that once they can access that $500,000 fund, manage it properly, then they are in a position to move upwards, to look at SME finances or to eventually get to the GCFs and the adaptation funds. Thank you.
We're fast running out of time. I'm going to come back to Sunga just to close this out. But before we end here, I want to also, in a self-serving way, ask all of you for the one thing that you would like the philanthropic community, including the Bosch Foundation perhaps, and the think tank community like Carnegie and others. Is there one thing that we can do in the next 6 to 18 months, just quickly, that could help address some of these gaps, questions you're wondering about, research, questions that need answering, that we could do in partnership? Go ahead, Sunga.
Thank you. Yes, a lot's been said about private sector, but considering the EBRD's focus on private sector and to your question, I think it's important to note that, these government plans, they need to be beyond just about government spending. And, it really has to send a market signal for businesses to really feel agency when they see it. So, no business in an environment where they think that there would not be secure, stable workforce, or their assets are going to be stranded, are going to be able to plan for the future and further invest. So I think it's very important to have inclusive processes. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to have more of plans or more of policies, separate pathways. Maybe it could be helpful depending on the circumstances, but it's really about having an inclusive process during what's already there where financiers, local financiers, project developers, technology providers, they also get to be part of the process and able to contribute. So in that sense, your kind of suggestion about disruptive technologies, about being able to provide data in a different way, finding that out and being part of the solution, at the get-go will be the way to go to accelerate action. And maybe to your point, I think in that sense, being able to for philanthropies to really see, okay, in the landscape of data, you've mentioned that there's already out there, but where are the data that are kind of less available? Because in the case of EBRD, for example, the regional coverage, sometimes there's a lot in the developed country markets, but not so in the countries that we operate. So being able to identify where the gaps are, or at what level, right? Is it the gap at when you have to translate into financial analysis? Because a lot of the analysis today do not account for the cost of inaction, right? And that's where it needs to really be calculated. So being able to contribute towards filling that gap, I think in the short term will be great. Thanks.
Great. Lightning round to close out. Luis, what can we help you with? Philanthropy and think tanks, either or?
That is basically the main request by the board of the FRLD, to explore innovation on addressing the loss and damage. And of course, I guess that Matthew already mentioned that still the architecture is leaning towards the public sector, right? Both as a beneficiary and also as a contributor to these funds. So part of the mandate for FRLD is to explore new frontiers. We are looking into practices that, for example, the CIF already had out of the CCMM, basically bonds that can be used for to swap, co-benefits from loss and damage. The second is to explore the boundaries of philanthropy. Let's not forget that FRLD is both a climate justice fund and at the same time a solidarity fund. So it's unlike the other funds. It relies a lot on the issue of our time. That the vulnerable communities are already experiencing tremendous stress and damages from climate change. So philanthropies are more and more aware of the need to also support the most vulnerable. And so far, the reception has been great. We have had conversations, say, with philanthropies such as the Gates Foundation, philanthropies such as Bloomberg. Some of them are in the US, some of them are in Europe. In Asia, Japan has been also a good partner so far. So we'll keep going, and hopefully, as part of our strategy to fundraise mobilize resources, which, as you know, for now we have about $700 million, mostly from the public sector contributors. Now we need to increase the donor base, amplify the scope of opportunities, and definitely the philanthropies play an important role.
Thank you so much.
Stay tuned with us, and
thank you so much, Luis. I'm afraid we need to keep moving because folks here are getting hungry. It's lunchtime. Matthew, really quickly, just one sentence. What can we do to help?
Okay, first and foremost, advocacy, especially in a world of declining ODA. Second, research, not only technical research, but also research on finance, especially when it comes to the financing of adaptation through the private sector. And last but not least, but I would argue this is for the larger pockets, philanthropies contribute to our funds.
Got it. Anthony?
Yeah, thank you very much. In the space of market mechanisms, everybody's talking about the market. The African Development Bank has developed a non-market mechanism called the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism, which is listed in Article 6.8. And I believe that that facility needs to be supported to bring the private sector into the adaptation space, as we've seen. Thank you.
Very interesting. And let's go back to the room. Go ahead.
Quickly, three things. One, absolutely agreeing with Matthew, advocacy around the role of climate finance in this space. We need to, more than ever, not defend the role of climate finance, but advocate for the positive opportunity that it brings. Two, given that this is a cross-sectoral and cross-sectional issue, helping us convene and collaborate, I think that is really one of the big gaps here so that we're more effective and we're not competitive. And three, what does good look like? Finding those opportunities to show us what is the value of climate finance in this space, where are the opportunities for scale and replication?
Fantastic.
Maybe just to add to what I said previously, it could be also helpful for the research and philanthropy communities to think about how to also incorporate the topic climate mobility per se into the existing work streams and helping all those development partners who are working on this to understand how to accelerate the integration.
Thank you. So data, as we already mentioned, in terms of more granular data and forecast instead of historical one that we currently generally work with. Second thing is going to be collaboration, not to duplicate and replicate what we want to do, but already scale up the initiatives that already exist and try to incorporate all the technical knowledge that we have access to. And the third thing is really technical training. I think the more people will be informed and will be familiar with the type of financing or parametric insurance that we provide, that's going to be better in terms of, embarking on those kind of measure. And in addition to that, going hand in hand with that, premium subsidies is key in terms of, again, scaling up. We have already started the work on that with the AFTB, and will be great to embark other development banks on that procedure and that initiative as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We are beginning this dialogue, not ending it. We'll come back to all of you for additional details. Thank you for being here. Please feel free to ask more questions during the break. Thank you.